All right, let's jump in. Let's talk about costs and scale. The big question here is how many firms fit into a market? And it turns out that the answer to this question determines a lot. If just one firm can fit in, we'll call it a monopoly. If a few firms fit in, it'll be an oligopoly. If a whole bunch fit in, we'll call it competition. But all of this hinges on how big a firm must be to achieve what you might call minimum efficient scale, or just the size where costs are lowest, or if you don't want to be that extreme, just the size where costs are low enough to really play. So there are two fundamentals. The first fundamental you could think of as long-run average cost. So this diagram shows the relationship between the quantity of output on the horizontal axis and the cost per unit of output on the vertical axis. We call it long-run average cost. Now this diagram has two different regions. There's this first region where long-run average cost is declining. We'll call this the IRS region, not because of the Internal Revenue Service, but because of increasing returns to scale. And the idea is that costs fall as the scale of operation is larger over some region. That is, over some range of quantity of output. There's another region we call the DRS region, or decreasing returns to scale, meaning that over that range of quantities of output, that costs are rising as the scale of the operation is larger. In the middle we have, sort of a Goldilocks point. Q star is the quantity of output that minimizes the cost of the operation. And so that would be the efficient scale for the firm depicted in this diagram. Now let's put that together with market demand. So again, the right-hand side picture is a picture of a particular firm, and it says that Q star is the quantity of output. Let's just summarize that as the scale of operation that has minimum cost. The picture on the left is a familiar picture from the last module. It's the market demand curve. Now the question is, how big is Q star, the Q star from the right-hand side picture, relative to market demand? Now, one possibility is that Q star is really small relative to market demand, in which case lots of firms will fit in this market, and it'll end up being what we call a competitive market. Another possibility is that Q star is large relative to the market. If it literally is over where this arrow, this right-hand side arrow touches the quantity axis, then literally just one firm will fit in the market, and it'll end up being a monopoly. But more generally, if a few firms fit, it'll be a concentrated market, or what we'll call an oligopoly. Now, an important aside before we go on is that firms don't have to have a decreasing returns to scale region. There are a number of firms that utterly dominate their industries and where size doesn't seem to be a disadvantage. Think about Google and its dominance in search. We'll come back to that more later in the course. But in any event, the textbook picture, and it's not a crazy picture, is a picture of there being some finite size that's the optimal scale for firms. And after all, most industries are not dominated by a single firm, and so the idea that firms have an ideal finite size is a pretty sensible idea. Recapping then on scale and market structure, when just one firm fits in a market, it's going to be a monopoly. When a few firms fit into a market, it's a concentrated industry or an oligopoly. When a lot of firms fit in a market, it's competitive. And this session is going to focus on competitive industries. Later in the course, we'll study concentrated market structures. Now, one of the things that makes the study of scale interesting is things that tend to change scale over time. Technological change is probably the biggest force changing optimal scale for firms. And I can illustrate this by talking about a few cases. So one case is retailing. In our lifetimes, there's been quite a substantial change in the market structure of retailing, and this stems from change in technology. First, let's start with a few facts. One fact is there's been a really substantial growth in both establishment size and firm size in retailing. Here's a dry-looking government statistics publication that just shows that the employees per establishment has been rising pretty substantially in retailing between the mid-20th century and the end of the 20th century. Much of this stems from what's been happening with Walmart. Now let me show you an interesting little movie, and then we'll come back and talk about what's going on. This movie shows the diffusion of Walmart since its founding. Each year, the red dots are new openings of stores, and the blue dots are the existing stores. Notice how it gravitates out from Arkansas and eventually envelops the country. This picture was created by my colleague Tom Holmes in the economics department at the University of Minnesota. Let's get back to the slideshow. Now, what's going on there? Well, it turns out that frequent deliveries and information technology, or IT, work together to really enhance productivity. Now, if you think back to that picture of Walmart diffusing across the country, one of the interesting things, or maybe the most interesting thing, is that the new stores are all located near existing stores. What's that about? Well, that's about having a dense network of places to deliver products. You know, you have trucks and so forth that are carrying products. Now that, in conjunction with really good information technology, you know, scanners that allow you to know in real time how much you've sold of each product in each place, that's made for great productivity gains, and it's made this business of being large, if you expand in places that are densely near other places that you already own, to be a very efficient way to go. So it's really helped Walmart. If you look at other data on investment in information technology and retail, you do see that large firms account for nearly all of the retail IT investment, and it really seems that IT improves productivity more for large firms. So this is a force favoring increased scale in one industry. We can talk about a very different case, though, the recorded music industry. So this is an industry that really has found itself rocked, if you will, by changes in technology in the last decade or so. Now, to understand this, think about the old business model. Now, I don't expect you to be an expert on this industry, but you know, a music label, what did it need to do? It needed to discover new artists. It needed to produce them, both in the sense of producing the album and making it sound good, but also literally physically producing physical albums, then distribute these physical albums, and then promote them to convince people that they want to buy them. And this all required lots and lots of capabilities inside of one organization. It required manufacturing, or the access to manufacturing for producing discs, physical distribution for moving these physical discs around, deals with retailers for selling these discs, as well as deals or some kinds of arrangements with radio stations to convince them to play the new music to promote it. Now, it's very expensive to have all these capabilities within one organization, and it required organizations to be large and powerful, and the result was a handful of, quote, major labels that dominated the recorded music industry. Now, along comes digitization. Now, by this, I just mean the development of digital technology, both computers and the internet. And now, how has it changed things? Well, think about all the stages in this process. Production is now very inexpensive. You don't need a fancy recording studio. All you need is some software like GarageBand and a computer. Distribution doesn't require trucks and record stores. All it requires is uploading an MP3 and making it available at iTunes, which one can do for about $10. Now, promotion is still challenging, but the internet allows lots of avenues for promotion without traditional radio, and so as a result, smaller scale firms, known as independent record labels, are now flourishing at the expense of traditional firms. And similar changes are really strongly afoot in the book publishing industry. So in this case, technological change seems to be promoting a smaller minimum efficient scale of operation, rather than in the retail case where technological change seemed to be promoting a larger minimum efficient scale of operation. In any event, though, it's pretty clear we're living through a really interesting period in history where technological change, much of it driven by computers and related technology, are really changing who wins and who loses in lots of industries. All right, so what's the takeaways on scale and costs? Well, the first is just that the question, how many firms fit in a market, is a really fundamental question, and it's important to how markets are going to operate. And if lots of firms fit in a market, it'll end up being a competitive market, and that's the kind we're focusing on in this module. Just one, a monopoly, a few, an oligopoly, and we'll get back to market structures like those beginning in about a week. The second point that's important, I think, is that technological change can alter how many can fit, and that we're living really in very interesting times.